Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 80 and I am the show's host Kyle. With me again today is Will Porter. Will is a journalist and commentator with a focus on U.S. foreign policy and Middle East affairs. His freelance work can be found at the Libertarian Institute and antiwar.com. How are you doing today, Will?
I'm good, Kyle. Thank you for having me on. How are you?
I'm doing well. Excited to have you on today. We're going to be talking Russiagate today. I know it's an issue that I've talked about on the show several times, but the narrative keeps changing and there's a lot going on with it. And so I'll bring Will on to just go through and really tackle the whole thing for us. So I think I'm going to have Will pretty much start at the beginning and tell us, Will, exactly kind of the myth you're debunking, how that, fits into the Russian hacking as a whole. And what does the claim Russia hacked the election mean right now?
Well, there have been a bunch of different iterations of this claim, but just to keep it simple, this all began with the claim that actors working on behalf of a Russian intelligence agency hacked into the computer system of the DNC, or the Democratic National Committee, and leaked information that was harmful to Hillary Clinton and her campaign. And I think it was initially put out there by Democrats who want to argue that Russian interference in the election is actually what got Trump elected. But the claim has kind of taken on a life of its own, and it's spun off into a bunch of different directions. But that's the basic claim, is that Russia used malware to hack the DNC. All
right, great. And so, let's see, in your article, you mentioned the Veterans Intelligence Professional Source Sanity memo. Tell us about the memo and why it's important.
Yeah, sure. The organization you're referring to is called VIPS, V-I-P-S, or the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. And this is basically a group of retired intelligence officials or agents, and they periodically will issue these critical memos to the president pointing out flaws in American policy or in the arguments that have been endorsed by the government. So anyway, that same group, the Veteran Intelligence Professionals, they put out a memo in late July, and it really undercuts the Russia hacked the election narrative. And there's a lot of ground I'm going to cover here, so I'm going to do my best to keep it all straight. So the memo that we're talking about, it's mostly centered around an independent investigation that was done by some cybersecurity analysts. And this can be found at a site called the Forensicator. And this investigation, it looks at metadata that was attached to files that were published by an actor named Guccifer 2.0. And this was in July of 2016. And so before I get into the memo further, I should explain who Guccifer is first, because this Veteran Intelligence Professionals memo has a lot to do with what Guccifer published in July of 2016. And so Guccifer 2.0 is said to be the Russian or Russian-related hacker who broke into the DNC last year and leaked documents and stuff, leaked documents to WikiLeaks. But this stuff has not been proven. That this is just what's said about Guccifer. But it's important to note here that this Guccifer 2.0 character, he published material in July of 2016, and that is separate from what WikiLeaks published. And that was, I think, a month earlier. And so this independent investigation we're going to talk about, it mostly pertains to the July publication by Guccifer. So just remember, there are two publications. We're talking about the second one. There was the WikiLeaks, and then there was what Guccifer published. And so returning to the metadata investigation that I brought up a second ago, there are two conclusions that really jump out at you. The first is that the computer system that was used to grab the DNC data, it was using Eastern time zone settings. And this suggests that the computer was located somewhere on the East Coast of the United States. And that would kind of preclude the idea of foreign hackers working remotely. But the second conclusion that really bolsters that one, and this one I think is more important is that the file transfer speed with which this person obtained this data, it was way too fast to have been a remote access. It almost certainly had to be someone with physical access to a DNC system. And so the investigation, they conclude that the possibility that this file transfer could have been done using remote access is too small to even consider as an option. And so to summarize what I've said here, based on the metadata that these investigators have obtained, the material published by Guccifer in July of 2016 almost certainly could not have been obtained by Russian hackers, contrary to what the media and politicians will tell you. But it doesn't end there with this Guccifer guy. It gets way more suspicious. And so with this publication of these documents by Guccifer in last July of 2016, it seems he made every attempt that he possibly could to put what we might call Russian fingerprints into the data, or things which clearly would indicate Russian involvement, but also things that would be very easy for a hacker to cover up. And so first of all, Guccifer bizarrely chose to name his computer account after the founder of the Soviet secret police, Felix Dzerzhinsky. And then he did things he used documents in a way that ensured that name would make its way into the metadata. And so that's very strange. Why would you deliberately put a Russian name into your metadata? It's very sloppy for a hacker to do if he wants to cover up his tracks. However, second of all, Guccifer chose to use a Russian VPN service to hide his IP address. But then he also used these web-based email services that would have revealed his use of that Russian VPN. And then, like a day later, he would contact a bunch of media outlets using that same email account. And so it's very clear that it seems clear that he wanted to look like he was a Russian. Because there's no experienced hacker working for a foreign state would be careless like that. And I should note, too, along these same lines, CrowdStrike, this is the cybersecurity firm hired to investigate the alleged hack, they claim to know that it was a state actor because of how slick and sophisticated it was, but yet they claim to know it was Russia because the hacker made these terrible childlike mistakes. And so that's very inconsistent. And finally, I'll say a little bit more about CrowdStrike itself, because there's a few interesting details there. So I already mentioned CrowdStrike. They were hired to investigate the DNC hack. And this firm also happens to be co-founded by a Russian expatriate, Dmitry Alperovich, and he serves as a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. And the Atlantic Council, of course, is an establishment think tank with ties to Hillary Clinton, and it's very hawkish toward Russia. And so that affiliation might say something about their leanings. And CrowdStrike actually refused to allow the FBI to look at the DNC servers themselves. And this forced the intelligence community to just go on their word about it, to go on their word of they say it was a Russian hack. And of course, in a previous case, CrowdStrike tried to blame Russia for another hacking incident in Ukraine, but that totally fell apart. Voice of America debunked that. We can put that in the show notes there. But sorry for such a long-winded answer, but there's a lot to include, to cover here.
No, absolutely. Thank you for that. And just to clarify, I think the most important part of what you said is that Vip's memo showed that it was not, the DNC emails were definitely not obtained by a hack, and that the analysis showed that they were obtained by somebody at the DNC
yes.
Who had access to the server.
Yeah, exactly. They said it could have been done over like a LAN network as well, but that is not likely that a Russian would have had access to that. Almost certainly it would have required physical access. And nobody's arguing that. Even the craziest of the Russia hacked the election people, nobody's claiming that a Russian hacker actually physically infiltrated a computer.
Yeah, at least not yet.
Right. Yeah, of course.
All right. Did I skip any other important details or anything else you thought was more important than that conclusion from the Vips memo?
No, I think that's basically the most like ironclad thing, that it just shows that it couldn't have been a remote hacker. It had to have been direct access.
Yeah, it seems to be a thorough debunking of the current Russiagate scenario. And now these memos are addressed to Donald Trump. I wonder if he ends up reading them.
I've wondered the same thing.
All right, and so what is the real story of how the DNC emails ended up at WikiLeaks, since it wasn't Russia?
Yes, and so here's the second half to this whole story here. And so we know that Russia almost certainly was not behind the Guccifer publication. We know that this Guccifer guy went out of his way to make himself look Russian, and we know the DNC hired a dodgy company to rubber stamp their claims about Russia. But we haven't talked about the first leak, which WikiLeaks announced that it had in June of 2016. And this is the big thing. This is what the Democrats say, like, lost Hillary the election. And so basically, to cut to the chase here, last week an audio recording surfaced. And this is a conversation between a guy named Ed Butowski, and he's sort of a GOP functionary for the Republican Party and a donor to the Republican Party. And he had a conversation with an investigative journalist named Seymour Hersh. And we've talked about Hersh on your show before. So your listeners might be familiar here with him. And so Ed Butowski became interested in the unsolved murder of the DNC staffer Seth Rich. And Seymour Hersh actually contacted Ed Butowski with explosive information about that case. And so Seymour Hersh told Ed Butowski, and this is all in an audio you can hear this audio recording, we can put it in the show notes. Seymour Hersh says he knows for a fact that Seth Rich was the man behind the initial leak to WikiLeaks. And Hersh says that he has an inside source who can access documents and sort of relay to him their contents. And that's how he knows this about Seth Rich. He said he saw an FBI, or he knows of an FBI document that proves this. And it's been speculated in the last few months that Rich was behind this leak. And so the confirmation from Hirsch is, I think, very important. And this is a journalist who's well known for his access to high-level sources, and he's had a lot of good scoops based on those sources. Regarding Seth Rich's murder, because this guy was murdered last summer, Hirsch doesn't think he thinks it had nothing to do with the leak, the murder, but that's sort of a side detail. But strangely, when Ed Butowski contacted Seymour Hirsch again to follow up and ask him to come forward with what he knows, Hirsch actually denied saying that he ever said any of this stuff. And so it's very strange that he would backtrack like that, but we have the audio of Hirsch's very distinctive voice saying this. And so either way, I don't think we can just dismiss the audio here. Hirsch, without a doubt, told Ed Butowski that Seth Rich was the leaker. He was the guy who gave the documents to WikiLeaks. And I don't think you can just wave that away with a denial.
All right. Well, I guess, I mean, the big question would be then, why would Hirsch walk back his claims? And then, I mean, how would this evaluate information you get from Hirsch? On this show, you brought him up in the past and is a source that you really like using.
Yeah. Well, one theory that was raised by Justin Raimondo at antiwar.com actually was that he thinks that Hirsch might be working on a story that either pertains to Seth Rich or that uses the same insider source. And so maybe Hirsch is he doesn't want to make anything public until he's finished with whatever he's writing. He doesn't want to spook his source and have him clam up. And I mean, that's a plausible explanation, but I'm totally speculating still. In light of Hirsch's denial, though, it does make me more skeptical. Like, it's weird. Why would he backtrack? But I still don't think you can reject it out of hand. I mean, if you go listen to the audio, there is no doubt about it. It is absolutely clear what Hirsch is saying. It's not an implication. It's not innuendo. It's not implied. It's very direct. Hirsch goes on for several paragraphs talking about Seth Rich and how he knows that he was connected to the leak.
Absolutely. And just for my part, I went and listened to that audio and then just some other interviews of Hirsch, and I drew the same conclusion as you, that it pretty much had to be him.
Right. I mean, he has a very distinctive voice, too. Like, you can definitely tell it's Seymour Hirsch.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, so we have all this information. The DNC emails didn't come through a Russian hack, through WikiLeaks. Seth Rich may or may not have been the leak. What is your current working theory on all of this? How does everything tie and play together?
Sure, yeah. So based on everything I've said up till now, I'll try to tie this all together and give you a theory of what could have happened here. And so my working theory is that a DNC data programmer named Seth Rich, who was angry about the way the DNC had sabotaged the campaign of Bernie Sanders, Seth Rich decides to make illicit access to a DNC computer and grabs a bunch of documents, and then sends them off to WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks announces that it has documents on Hillary Clinton on June 12th, 2016, and says it's about to publish them. So then the DNC then calls up CrowdStrike, and on June 14th, just 2 days after WikiLeaks announced that it has these documents, CrowdStrike announces that it found Russian malware on the DNC system. And I believe that this was done to get out in front of the WikiLeaks publication. They want to taint everything with claims of Russian involvement. And so basically Seth Rich makes this leak, the DNC discovers it, and they want to try to preempt it and get out in front of it. And so within 2 days, they announce that, it was the Russians hacked this. And so then in the meantime, between June and July of 2016, some unknown actor within the DNC carries out another file transfer. And this is what the independent investigation was about. The second file transfer, the one that we know couldn't have been done by Russians. And so I believe that they took this is the stuff that Guccifer also published. So I believe the DNC somehow managed to copy this data, send it to Guccifer, and have him publish it in July, pretending to be, and he, of course, did all this stuff to make himself look Russian, like I mentioned earlier. And so I believe basically the DNC had CrowdStrike come out and say there was Russian involvement, and then they did something to relay these documents to whoever this Guccifer guy is, and imply that he's a Russian too. And there's actually a independent analyst named Adam Carter, and I'll provide a link for this as well for the show notes. But Adam Carter, this analyst, believes that CrowdStrike itself was behind the Guccifer operation. He actually thinks that Dmitry Alperovich and his partners and stuff actually were behind this. And he kind of lays out his argument in the article that I'll send you. But somebody relayed this information to this Guccifer guy, and it initially did come from the DNC, from a direct access. And so that's basically the working theory, is that there was a real legit leak by Seth Rich, and then the DNC shortly after did all this stuff to try to taint the leak and make it look like it would all be Russian involved.
All right. Well, very interesting theory, Will. I guess at the point where we're at now, we don't have all the evidence we need to confirm or deny any theory. What kind of evidence may you be looking for that you think would help to confirm your theory? Maybe where would the evidence come from? Anything like that?
Well, I want to hear more about what happens with the Seymour Hersh thing, because I don't believe that this will just be all, that he'll deny it. I think we should wait and see if any more action happens with that, with Ed Butowski and Seymour Hersh. Because I think that recording, whatever Hersh claims he knows, I think that's important, so we should focus on that maybe.
All right. Well, very interesting. Anything else you would like to comment on specifically about your article, Will?
No, I think we covered everything. And unless you have any questions specifically, like that, anything you want me to clear up, because I realize I just dumped a lot of information on you guys.
No, I think you did a pretty good job of summing everything up. I think we hit really on the two key points, and then the what's to come with the Hersh.
Right.
Whether he comes out with the article and maybe has the whole story here or just continues to deny it.
Yeah, I'm very curious.
So one thing that I know you know quite a bit about, and that's kind of just how all this Russiagate stuff really ties into foreign policy. And I think a lot of people even just believe the Russiagate thing in the first place because of the whole Russian aggression narrative. And so what do you think about, kind of just like the Russian aggression narrative and how that led people to believe that Russia could hack the U.S. election?
Yeah, well, I think it all kind of traces back to, of course, the Cold War and the Soviet Union. They were our biggest adversary for the whole second half, at least, of the 20th century. And even though the Cold War has been over for decades, there are still people who haven't really gotten over it. And so there are older people who were alive, when the Soviet Union was around. I think you and I are a bit too young for that. But so I think that's a big thing, just lingering fears and hostility and resentment about the Soviet Union. However, much more recently, something more directly relevant to current events is the phrase Russian aggression popped up actually around 2014. And this was as Russia's neighbor, Ukraine, was going through some political turmoil and troubles. Basically what happened there was the United States orchestrated a coup in Ukraine, and it took out a government that was somewhat friendly to Russia and replaced it with a very hostile one. And so as some of its first official acts, the post-coup government in Ukraine, they got rid of Russian as an official language, they launched a war on pro-Russian separatists in the east of Ukraine, and most importantly, they made moves to rescind Russia's lease on its naval base in Crimea. And that's where Russia's Black Sea naval fleet has been stationed since the 1700s. And so this is a big deal, trying to get rid of their port. And so Russia wasn't going to let that happen, and especially because Crimea is historically a Russian territory. It was only recently transferred to Ukraine in the waning days of the Soviet Union. And so anyway, Russia basically re-annexed Crimea and took it over. And this is really what started the whole Russian aggression thing. However, regarding aggression, there wasn't really any bloodshed with this, and there was no real invasion either. There was soldiers who had already been stationed legally in Crimea. And then Crimeans would vote in a referendum to separate from Ukraine, and those results would be confirmed by Pew and Gallup later. And so this is what has been primarily called Russian aggression. I find it kind of ridiculous. There wasn't a whole lot of violence or aggression involved, and it was purely a response to an extremely provocative American policy. Yet to this day, American politicians are still trying to use the Ukraine issue as sort of a proxy against Russia. And, of course, similar claims are made about Russia's actions in Syria, and that kind of ties into this whole hack the election thing that's stoking some hostility with them. But the Syria thing, I think, is just as baseless as Crimea, but maybe that's a story for another day.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to add to that, we know that the U.S. was behind the coup. We have Victoria Nuland in a phone call. I think the YouTube video is titled F the EU, and if you listen to that, you'll hear Victoria Nuland plotting the coup in Ukraine. And then we also have a member of the CFR saying that the U.S. stole Russia's girlfriend being Ukraine while Putin was off joining the 2014 Winter Games in Sochi, which of course is on the opposite side of Russia. And so they thought that was really cute and clever.
Yeah, it was on the Colbert Report, right?
Yeah. And then just the other thing to go along with all this, in 2014, you of course had this Russia aggression line popping up. And at the same time, you have a man named Omar the Chechenian running rampant in Syria and Iraq, winning battle after battle for ISIS. And the interesting thing about this is Omar the Chechenian was a kind of Russian jihadist revolutionary trained by the United States of America. And so while America's aggression against Russia was to train jihadists, to go fight against them, that ended up obviously blowing back against the United States. But it's just funny how we're talking about Russian aggression when you have such a blatant example of U.S. aggression literally spreading itself across the Middle East.
Yeah, it's hypocrisy.
Yeah. And we also have NATO expansion going on, too. I remember at one point Hillary Clinton complaining about Russian conducting military games right on the border with NATO. Yeah. But Hillary Clinton failed to mention that Russia's military games were inside of Russia. Yes. And that's because the border of NATO has pushed all the way up to Russia.
That is one of the most, it's like funny because it's so ridiculous, but it is one of the most preposterous, like worrying kind of things where you're accusing a country of aggression within its own borders, and you've pushed your organization so far forward that it's touching its borders, and so yeah, it is on NATO borders. It's preposterous.
All right. Well, so this whole Russiagate thing, where has it got us? What's the importance, to really this podcast, Foreign Policy Focus? How is this all related to U.S. foreign policy and the U.S.-Russian relationship?
Yeah, well, the way I see it, I think anything that makes conflict more likely between the two largest hydrogen bomb arsenals should always be avoided. And so all the stuff pertaining to Russian hacking and Russian aggression and Ukraine and Syria, I think it's kind of moving us in that direction broadly. And NATO expansion, too, is another very good example of that. And so I think the more our government makes baseless accusations against Russia and antagonizes Russia, the more likely we are to move closer to a war. Not a Cold War, a real war. I hope that's still far off the horizon, but we might be marching closer to it. And I mean, Soviet communism was an absolute horror, but that's been over with now for decades. I feel like people need to stop living in the past and start moving forward. We should stop with all the hostilities, as if it's still, as if the Soviet Union still exists.
Absolutely, and I think also, Will, we're missing out on some of the really benefits of U.S.-Russian relationships outside of the nuclear weapons issue, and just in Syria, Trump and Putin had 1-2 hour conversation, and we have a lasting ceasefire in the southwestern area of Syria. And so, I mean, that's substantial. We haven't really had a ceasefire in Syria hold that long, ever. So, we, moving in the right direction, having these two leaders talk, and it's just a shame that there's kind of been this wedge driven in between them, and it seems like now they really can't even talk to each other. We, of course, have, only 5 members of Congress vote against the sanctions bill that passes through that pretty much ensures that U.S. and Russia can't get along.
Right. And Trump can't reverse that himself, right?
It's limited. I mean, what the president can and can't do is, seems pretty subjective.
Right.
But yeah. All right. Well, do you have anything else that you would like to add, to this whole conversation?
Yeah, I guess one little point that I forgot to mention, and that people I think already know, but just to spell it out. Donald Trump has been one of the only candidates, especially on the Republican side, who has talked about his desire to get along better with Russia and Vladimir Putin. And so I don't think it's any coincidence that as soon as we have a candidate do that and he wins, we see all this Russia stuff, Russian hacking, Russian aggression, Russian whatever. It seems very clear that they're trying to scuttle any attempt on his behalf to do what he claimed he'd do. Now, I don't have a lot of faith in their promises in the first place, but still, you can see this. It's a very clear reaction to his rhetoric.
All right, well, that sounds good. And why don't you plug all of your work and tell everybody where they can find you?
Sure. My name's Will Porter. I'm a journalist. You can find my personal blog at tlvanguard.wordpress.com or the Libertarian Vanguard. Up until recently, I was a news writer and a columnist for a site called The Daily Sheeple, and so you'll still be able to find my work there. It'll still be on the site. And then, as Kyle said earlier in the intro, you can find some of my freelance stuff in the blog at the Libertarian Institute and the Viewpoint section of antiwar.com.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on. If anybody would like to share the podcast that me and Will were on today, we really appreciate it. That's at foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com or on the Facebook page, Kyle's Files. Thank you so much for tuning in, and thanks for being on, Will.
Thanks, Kyle.